We live in an age where belief is often equated with naivety. People say, be realistic, rely on facts, not faith. And yet, we must ask, is it truly realistic to place ultimate trust in human strength when we are so prone to error, frailty, and forgetfulness? Faith, rightly understood, is not a denial of reason. It is the highest use of reason, the recognition that beyond all we can see and explain, there is a God whose power is not constrained by our limitations. He does not merely do some things, he can do all things. Not because he is a magician, but because he is the author. To believe in such a God is not to live in delusion. It is to live in alignment with the deepest reality, that the universe has a moral and personal center, and that center is not us. The God who can do all things does not act according to our whims, but according to his wisdom. And this should comfort us, not frustrate us. For if he only did what we wanted, he would not be a God worth worshipping, merely a mirror reflecting our desires. Some say, I prayed and nothing changed. But faith is not tested by instant results. It is revealed by steady trust. The God who can do all things often chooses to work through time, process, and even apparent silence. That is not weakness. It is mercy. For in the delay our character is shaped. In the waiting our vision clears. In the silence our hearts learn to listen. And yet, make no mistake, this God is not passive. When the time is right, he speaks, he moves, and no force in heaven or on earth can stand against him. To place your faith in him is not to escape reality, but to be anchored in it. The mountains may shake, the seas may roar, but those who trust in the God who can do all things stand firm, not because they are strong, but because they are held. What is required, then, is not grand gestures of belief. A mustard seed of faith is enough, provided it is placed in the right hands. And these hands, the hands of the one who shaped stars and souls, are always capable, always compassionate, and always near. Many people today equate faith with make-believe, as if to believe in something beyond the physical world is to abandon reason altogether. This is a mistake, not only logically, but spiritually. Faith, in its truest form, is not a denial of reality, but an engagement with the deepest truths about existence, truth, and trust. It is not a leap into the dark, but a walk into the light, a light that reveals the world in ways cold reason alone cannot. To understand faith rightly, one must recognize the difference between credulity and conviction. Credulity is believing something without evidence or discernment. It is passive and blind. Conviction, however, is the result of reflection, experience, and a deep understanding of what is worthy of belief. Faith belongs to this second category. It is not the product of emotional desperation or ignorance, but the conclusion of a thoughtful soul who has looked at the world, at history, at the conscience within, and come to trust in the reality of something, or rather someone, greater than themselves. Reason leads us to faith, but it cannot carry us the whole way. That's not because faith contradicts reason, but because reason, by its very nature, reaches a point where it must either halt or trust. Just as a scientist must trust the reliability of his instruments before interpreting the data, the believer trusts that the moral order, the sense of beauty, the pull of conscience, and the cry for justice all point to a mind beyond the material. When we trust in God, we are not abandoning thought, we are completing it. Consider the structure of the universe. It operates with mathematical precision, governed by laws so consistent that scientists can predict eclipses centuries in advance. Now ask yourself, how did such order arise from chaos? Where did this rational structure come from? Randomness does not produce beauty, nor does chaos create cosmos. The rationality of the world suggests a rational creator. Faith sees this and responds accordingly. Look also at human nature. We long for meaning, we ache for justice, we grieve at evil. These are not accidents of evolution, but echoes of something eternal. Why do humans, unlike any other species, tell stories, sing songs, and build cathedrals? Why do we sense right and wrong even when we fail to live by them? Why do we hunger for truth even when it is painful? Faith answers these questions not with escapism, but with insight, that we were made by a moral, intelligent being in whose image we reflect. And then there is the testimony of history. Across centuries, across cultures, countless individuals, many brilliant, many broken, have testified to the reality of God. They were not mad. They were not all deceived. Their experiences cannot be explained away by psychology or culture. From ancient prophets to modern thinkers, there runs a golden thread of testimony that declares we are not alone, and we were not made by accident. Now some may say, if this God is real, why doesn't he simply prove himself to us beyond all doubt? But consider, if he did that, would we believe out of love or out of fear? Would we follow him freely or submit out of obligation? Faith requires freedom, and love is never compelled. God has provided enough evidence to satisfy the mind that truly seeks, but not so much as to force the hand of the one who resists. It is the posture of the heart that determines what the eyes can see. Moreover, faith is not static. It grows. It begins with trust, and it deepens with experience. You do not wait until you fully understand gravity before you trust it to keep your feet on the ground. In the same way, you do not need to have full knowledge of God in order to begin trusting him. In fact, it is through trusting him that we come to know him better. Faith and understanding are not enemies, they are partners. Faith begins where understanding ends, but it does not end there. It draws us deeper into wisdom. Lastly, faith is not a private, wishful feeling. It has content, it has shape. It has roots in history, in revelation, and in the person of God who has acted in time and space. The God in whom we place our faith is not an idea, but a living being, a creator, a judge, a redeemer. To trust him is not to shut one's eyes to reality, but to open them to a reality far more profound than molecules and mathematics. Thus, true faith is the most rational response to a world that is too meaningful, too ordered, too beautiful, and too broken to be the result of blind chance. It is not fantasy. It is the sober, thoughtful, courageous decision to trust in the one who stands behind all that is good, all that is true, and all that is possible. The phrase, God can do all things, is often misunderstood to mean that God will do whatever we ask, however we ask it, and precisely when we expect it. But such a notion turns God into a cosmic vending machine, a divine servant who exists to fulfill our whims. This is not omnipotence. It is caricature. God's power is not subject to human desires, and his will is not bound by our limited perspectives. His omnipotence is inseparable from his perfect wisdom and moral nature. He does not merely possess infinite power, he exercises that power only in accordance with truth, justice, and love. If God could do literally anything, even what is irrational or evil, he would not be good, nor would he be consistent, trustworthy, or worthy of worship. For example, God cannot lie, not because of any deficiency, but because lying is inconsistent with his nature. Omnipotence does not mean God can contradict his own character. It means he can do anything that is logically possible and morally coherent. In other words, he can do all things that align with who he truly is, and who he is always right, always wise, always just. People often pray for things that seem right to them in the moment, but are in fact short-sighted or harmful in the long term. A child may ask for candy before every meal, and a good parent refuses, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. In the same way, God sometimes says no, not because he cannot grant the request, but because granting it would damage our soul, hinder our growth, or rob us of something better yet unseen. His no is often an act of mercy disguised as silence or delay. God's omnipotence is not random force, but intentional action. Power without purpose is dangerous, but God's power always operates according to his nature, and his nature is holy. He does not simply act, he acts rightly. This means that his power is not limited in capacity, but directed in purpose. He may not do all things we desire, but he always does what is right, even when we do not understand it. Consider also that our desires are often shaped by fear, pride, or impatience. We want immediate relief from suffering, instant success, visible signs, or answers that confirm our assumptions. But God sees a much larger story, the eternal narrative in which our short trials produce enduring transformation. He acts from the vantage point of eternity, not the panic of the present. What feels like delay to us may be divine timing. What seems like a closed door may be the redirection of a loving and powerful hand. God's omnipotence means he is never unable, never overwhelmed, never lacking in strength. But he is not reckless. He does not use his strength to impress, but to redeem. When he calms a storm, it is not to show off, but to reveal peace. When he raises the dead, it is not to astonish, but to point toward resurrection. His power is never separated from purpose. His ability is always connected to what is good. And so, the proper response to God's omnipotence is not to demand, but to trust. Not to manipulate, but to surrender. To recognize that he can do all things is not a license to expect all things on our terms, but an invitation to trust that he knows best, even when we do not see the outcome we hoped for. Faith in omnipotence is not control over the future, but rest in the one who holds the future. It is also crucial to remember that God's most powerful acts are often invisible to the natural eye. Changing a human heart, healing a wounded soul, bringing peace in the middle of suffering. These are not lesser miracles than parting seas or feeding thousands. In fact, they may be greater. God's power is not confined to the spectacular. It is just as real in the quiet, the slow, the unnoticed. Therefore, when we say God can do all things, we must mean all things that are right, all things that are true, and all things that flow from the wellspring of his eternal wisdom. This keeps us from childish entitlement and leads us into mature trust. For the God who created the universe is not only able, he is good, and when he acts, he always does what is right. The real measure of faith is not in moments of abundance, success, or answered prayers. True faith is revealed when the heavens are silent, when prayers seem unanswered, when the future is uncertain, and when no evidence appears to support what we believe. It is in the silence that faith speaks loudest, in the waiting that belief is forged, and in the absence of proof that trust becomes pure. Many people believe as long as things are going their way. But when adversity strikes, when illness lingers, when relationships fail, or when provision dries up, they begin to doubt not only God's timing, but his very presence. They confuse the lack of immediate results with the absence of divine activity. Yet God is not idle just because we cannot see his hand. His work often begins beneath the surface, in places the eye cannot detect and the mind cannot comprehend. Just as a seed buried in the soil disappears before it grows, so too does divine work often require hidden time before it bears visible fruit. Faith is not a feeling, and it is certainly not the byproduct of constant reassurance. It is a decision to trust in the character of God when there is no evidence in the present to justify it. When Abraham waited for years with no child, when Joseph languished in prison after being faithful, when the Israelites stood at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, their faith had to stand on the foundation of God's promise alone. No signs, no assurances, just the memory of his word and the weight of his nature. This is where many falter, for they assume that if God were truly at work, the evidence would be immediate. But that is not how spiritual maturity grows. Waiting is part of God's curriculum. It teaches patience, deepens dependency, and detaches us from outcomes we cannot control. The absence of results becomes a refining fire, separating what we believe about God from what we want from him. Do we believe he is good because he gives us what we want, or because his nature is goodness itself? When the results we expect do not arrive, the temptation is to lower our expectations of God, to shrink our prayers, to stop believing boldly. But that is precisely the moment when faith is meant to rise. Faith declares, even if I do not see it now, I believe he is working. This is not delusion, it is devotion. It is not blindness, but clarity, a clarity that sees beyond circumstance to the character of God. The silence of God is not the absence of God. Often, he is most at work when he appears most hidden. The shaping of the soul does not usually happen in seasons of ease, but in the furnace of uncertainty. There, in the struggle, faith gains strength not from proof, but from perseverance. God does not always remove the mountain. Sometimes he builds the muscle needed to climb it. Moreover, we must remember that the results we seek are not always the results God intends. We ask for success, He may offer sanctification. We ask for escape, He may provide endurance. What appears to be a delay or denial may, in fact, be divine redirection. God is not merely in the business of delivering outcomes. He is forming souls. And that formation requires seasons in which the only thing left to do is believe. When we cannot trace His hand, we are called to trust His heart. That is not sentiment. It is spiritual discipline. It means believing that God's purposes are still moving even when the path appears blocked. It means holding to the truth that delays are not denials and apparent failures are not the final word. Faith that rests only on results is fragile. Faith that rests on God's nature is unshakable. In the classroom of silence, faith becomes less about getting answers and more about becoming anchored. It deepens from surface-level belief into something rooted and immovable. In this way, the absence of visible results is not a contradiction of faith, but a catalyst for its maturity. Faith is often mistaken for imagination dressed in religious language. People think if they visualize a particular outcome vividly enough and attach God's name to it, they are exercising faith. But genuine faith is not a projection of one's will upon the heavens. It is surrender to a wisdom that surpasses understanding. It is not demanding that God fulfill our vision, but trusting that His vision is greater, even when it contradicts our expectations. To believe God will do what you imagine is to place your confidence in your own understanding. Yet Scripture and reason both teach us that the human mind is limited, fallible, and frequently driven by fear, pride, or partial knowledge. Our imagination is shaped by experience, and our desires are shaped by need. But God's decisions are shaped by eternity. What He chooses to do may sometimes align with what we hope for, but often it will transcend it, challenge it, or even seem to oppose it, for our own good. Faith does not cling to a specific outcome. It clings to a specific person. It says, "Even if I don't get what I asked for, I still believe you are good." This is not a weak or lesser form of faith. In fact, it is stronger, for it resists the urge to reduce God to a servant of human will. It accepts that God is not a tool of our desires, but the author of what is ultimately best. The essence of mature faith lies in relinquishment. It is the spiritual posture that prays boldly, but then opens the hand and says, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours." This is not passivity, nor is it defeat. It is the highest form of trust, the kind that acknowledges God's wisdom over one's own, and His love even in painful redirection. To trust God to do what is best is to accept that we are not always the best judges of what we need. Many confuse faith with certainty about outcomes. They believe that if they have enough faith, their plans will succeed, their sickness will be healed, their dreams will be fulfilled exactly as imagined. But such thinking sets one up for spiritual disappointment. When the imagined outcome does not occur, they do not question their imagination, they question God. True faith does the reverse. It questions the self, but not the one who is eternally faithful. God's best does not always feel best in the moment. Sometimes it looks like closed doors, prolonged waiting, uncomfortable change, or necessary loss. These are not signs of abandonment, but of refinement. God's priority is not ease, but transformation. He is not in the business of catering to comfort, but of conforming us to the likeness of truth. What we think we want is often a shadow of what He truly intends. There are times when we ask God for something, and He says no, not because He is cruel, but because He loves us too deeply to give us less than what we truly need. A child may plead for the freedom to touch fire, not understanding the consequences. The parent's refusal is love in action. Likewise, God's no, or His silence, may be the loudest proclamation of His care. To trust that God will do what is best is not to become fatalistic or disengaged. It is to become aligned with the rhythms of divine timing, with the logic of eternal purpose, with the slow unfolding of something wiser than mere human plans. It is to pray with passion, and yet surrender with peace. This kind of faith is not grown in comfort but in struggle. It is not built by instant gratification, but by walking through seasons of uncertainty without abandoning hope. It learns to live in the tension between desire and surrender. It endures the ache of unanswered prayer and still worships. It embraces mystery without resentment. It holds on, not to outcomes, but to the one who sees the whole picture. Such faith is not naive. It does not pretend to know how things will turn out. But it does know that whatever the result, God will still be God, and He will still be good. To believe this is to be free from anxiety over results, free from the tyranny of outcomes, free to live in the present with confidence that whatever comes will not escape the hand of divine love. Obedience is the clearest evidence of trust. To say one has faith but disobeys the voice of God is like claiming to trust a guide but refusing to follow the path he marks. Faith is not merely a mental agreement with divine truths, it is a lived response to them. And this response is most meaningful when the instructions of God defy human logic, contradict personal preference, or require sacrifice. True faith is not tested when the commands are convenient. Anyone can follow when the way is smooth, when the steps make sense, when obedience aligns with personal desires or public affirmation. But when the command of God leads into the wilderness, when it seems to risk safety, reputation, or success, that is when faith is proven. Obedience in confusion is the deepest form of worship. Noah built an ark when there had never been rain. Abraham left his homeland without knowing his destination. Moses returned to Egypt with only a staff and a promise. Each of these was an act of obedience that could not be justified by human reason alone. They trusted that the voice which commanded them knew more than they did, even when their senses screamed otherwise. Obedience often requires detaching from visible certainty. The steps God asks us to take may not come with explanations or assurances. They may lead through hardship, not around it. He may say, "Forgive," when the wound is still raw. He may say, "Give," when the supply is scarce. He may say, "Go," when the destination is unclear. The path of faith is rarely marked by comfort, but always by purpose. There is a profound mystery in the way God works through obedience. What He asks of us may seem small, strange, or even foolish, but hidden in that obedience is often the seed of something far greater than we can understand in the moment. The walls of Jericho did not fall because marching is a sound military strategy. They fell because God's wisdom transcends human tactics. The miracle was not in the method, but in the obedience. Faith-filled obedience does not demand full understanding before action. It is content to act while understanding grows. It values alignment over explanation. When we wait to obey until every detail makes sense, we elevate our reasoning above divine instruction. But obedience that waits for clarity is not obedience. It is negotiation. God's commands are rarely arbitrary, but they are often mysterious. He sees the end from the beginning. We see only the next step. To obey in faith is to walk by revelation, not by calculation. It is to believe that though the path is strange, the guide is trustworthy. This trust must be so strong that it overrides the inner protest of doubt or fear. Obedience is also costly. It may cost reputation, comfort, plans, or control. It requires humility to lay down one's own strategy and submit to a higher wisdom. Many resist this kind of surrender because they fear what they cannot predict. But in clinging to control, they forfeit the very transformation that faith offers. Sometimes obedience brings immediate reward. Other times it brings long periods of waiting. But regardless of the visible result, obedience always bears fruit, often not in circumstances, but in the soul. Every act of submission refines the character. It purifies motives, strengthens resilience, and deepens intimacy with the God who calls. The difficulty of obedience is not always in the action itself, but in the silence that follows. After obeying, one may not feel immediate confirmation. There may be no sign that it worked, but obedience is not a tool to manipulate outcomes. It is an offering, a declaration that God is worthy of trust, even when His ways are hidden. In a world that prizes self-direction and individual reasoning, faith-based obedience looks foreign. It resists the temptation to follow every cultural trend or personal impulse. It listens for the quiet voice of truth and follows even when no one else understands. This is not weakness. It is courage. It is the strength to yield, the bravery to follow a path that cannot be seen to its end. To obey without full understanding is to say, I trust the one who commands more than I trust what I see. This is the heart of faith, not belief without reason, but belief beyond reason. A trust that acts, a trust that yields, a trust that walks, even when the road is dark and the steps seem strange. The stability of faith depends entirely on where it is planted. Faith that is rooted in outcomes, timing, or personal desires is inherently fragile. When disappointment arrives, and it inevitably does, that kind of faith collapses like a structure built on sand. But faith that is anchored in the unchanging character of God endures every storm. It is not dictated by the weather. It is grounded in the rock. The world measures truth by what is seen, felt, and experienced. But faith is a different faculty. It sees through the lens of who God is, not just what life looks like. To trust God in sunshine is one thing. To trust Him when clouds darken the sky and the winds of uncertainty howl is quite another. But that deeper trust is only possible when the heart has become convinced, not merely of God's power, but of His goodness. God's character is not seasonal. He is not kind on Monday and indifferent on Tuesday. His nature does not change with world events, personal emotions, or societal opinions. He is as faithful when prayers are unanswered as He is when they are fulfilled. He is as present in the silence as He is in the miracle. To root one's faith in His character is to say, even if I do not understand what you're doing, I trust who you are. This kind of faith is not built in a day. It grows through testing. It develops when, having cried for a breakthrough that did not come, the soul still kneels in trust. It matures in seasons of lack, of waiting, of broken dreams. It is when life is stripped bare of its comforts that one discovers whether their faith was in the gifts or the giver. Circumstances are unstable, ever-changing, and often deceptive. What looks like failure may be the very tool of refinement. What feels like abandonment may be preparation for deeper revelation. If one allows emotions or appearances to dictate faith, it will constantly rise and fall. But when faith is tied to the eternal, not the temporal, it becomes unshakable. God has never promised that life will make sense, but He has promised that He is wise. He has not pledged to fulfill every desire, but He has pledged that His plans are for good. Trust in His character means trusting not just what He does, but why He does it, even when the why is hidden behind a veil of mystery. It is confidence that even in the dark, He is still light. Many imagine faith to be a shield that keeps them from suffering. But faith is not escape. It is endurance. It is not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope in the midst of it. Faith does not deny the difficulty of the road. It simply declares that God walks the road with us. And that assurance becomes stronger when it is grounded in His unwavering nature. To know the character of God is to know that He does not waste pain, that He does not abandon His own, that His silence is not absence, and His delays are not denials. It is to remember that the same God who allowed Joseph to be thrown into a pit is the one who raised him to a palace. The same God who allowed Lazarus to die is the one who called him forth from the grave. The character of God is never in question, even when the plot twists. Faith rooted in God's character will not demand a timeline, nor will it crumble under pressure. It will weep, perhaps, but it will not quit. It will tremble, but it will not break. It knows that circumstances change, sometimes dramatically, but the one in whom it believes is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is a kind of faith that needs no miracle to sustain it. It draws strength not from changing events, but from the unchanging one. It sees beyond today's valley because it knows the shepherd. It endures the night because it trusts the keeper of stars. It lives with an eternal perspective, refusing to judge God's goodness by temporary outcomes. When a person becomes convinced of who God is, not just intellectually, but in the marrow of the soul, they cannot be shaken. They may be bruised by life, but not undone. Their faith is no longer built on what God does for them, but on who He is to them. That kind of faith remains when all else fades.